Good afternoon. I'm not sure how to do this introduction because I can't even see this. I'm going to have to dig out my reading glasses. Ron has an unbelievable amount of experience in this good old world. And currently he's the CEO of the United Way of the Mid-Valley United Way. Willamette Valley United Way, and he has also been the CEO of Community Resource Trust in Salem. He has been the president of the Department of Mission Advancement, and I'm not sure what that is. And in 2005 to 2013, he was the president of the Marion Polk Food Share. And he's also been Emergency Medical Services Coordinator for Northwest Medical Teams. And he's, just in the last couple of years, he's taught at the Atkinson School here at Willamette. And he has been an adjunct instructor at George Fox University in the MBA program. And I'm going to skip through a bunch of this stuff because he's got all kinds of qualifications. He's a paramedic instructor. He obviously is a paramedic. And I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of this stuff because, I mean, he's been around. Just to give you an example on his international experience, as a volunteer and also studying, he's been in the countries of Rwanda, Republic of Congo, Romania, Mexico, Honduras, Turkey, India, Uzbekistan, Peru, Sri Lanka, Indonesia. He's had international education in China and an MBA program. And a few weeks ago, I was attending a Rotary Club in Silverton. And this is where I met Ron. And he gave a presentation he's going to give to you today. And Rotary International has a motto. And their motto is service above self. And Ron was asked by his Rotary Club in Silverton to give a presentation on one of the things that in his life where he experienced service above self. And this is what he came up with. His experience in, I believe it was Rwanda. And I think Lee is the one who brought this voodoo doll up here. So we'll see how that affects you. Please welcome Ron Hayes.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to come here until Phil said, would you come here and do what you did at Rotary? And like he was talking about, service above self is an important element for me personally as a personal motto. It is a motto of Rotary, but it goes beyond Rotary. And so I was asked to share about myself, about my background. And so I made this presentation because it's one of the most pivotal times in my life of what I did. What he didn't mention besides the international is I also was a paramedic working in the rescue at Ground Zero at the World Trade Center in 9/11. So I've had a huge, I call it a very fortunate life of being able to do lots of things for many people. And most of them have been fairly austere circumstances. And so I was, as a paramedic, I was in very austere, so it was familiar ground for me in many respects. I became a paramedic going through training at the University of Oregon Health Sciences Center before I became OHSU, and I did my paramedic training up there, one of the very first paramedic classes that they had up there. And I worked as a paramedic from 1980 up until 2001 when I went to work for Northwest Medical Teams, and I still worked as a paramedic even abroad. But I no longer hold my paramedic license. I decided that's a young person's job, and I'm getting pretty old, and so I better let some of that go. But anyway, I want to talk to you a little bit about an experience that I had and share with you a little bit about this service above self and this one experience that I have. the discussion I had on it at Rotary was really the first public discussion I've ever had of my experience. So you got to hear my very first expression about this. This is my second presentation on this event. So anyway, even though I haven't presented much on it, it still is a pivotal part of my life. If you ever come over to my office, you'll see a picture on my wall, and I'll show you that picture in a minute, of why I got involved in helping other people. Once upon a time, in a land far away, oops, we'll get this. On April 6th, 1994, a plane like this was coming in the afternoon for a landing. Normal landing. When all of a sudden, from the ground, 2 missiles were fired. And it knocked down this airplane, and with it was killed both the president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi, who were landing at the Kigali airport 25 years ago. April 7th, the very next day, it became evident that an organized effort was underway, and the radios were taken over by Hutu hardliners. Hutus were a tribe. There was 2 main tribes in Rwanda at that time, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And they had been at war for a lot, back and forth, skirmishes back and forth. But anyway, the Hutu hardliners started a genocide of the Tutsis. And they also started by killing not only the Tutsis, but also any sympathetic Hutus. And the killing was done by the military, by the Interahamwe, which is the militias that were there, and also the everyday person, mobs of people. It was a brutal killing. In that period of time of just about 3 months, 800,000 people were massacred and killed. A lot of people don't realize how many people were killed. 800,000 is a lot of people in that period of time. I believe that killing rate exceeded what we saw in World War II in the genocide caused by the Nazis, the speed of what happened. They took over the radios and they said, we need to clear the cockroaches. That's what they called the Tutsis. We need to get rid of the cockroaches. And they had lists of people, and it was an organized massacre in many respects, even though it was done by mobs. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't good. Some of these pictures are hard to look at, I realize, so I won't stay on them very long. And on the Ugandan border were a lot of refugee Tutsis that had fled there and had grown up there from previous skirmishes in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis. There were actually entire villages along the border with Uganda. And there was a group called the RFP, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF. And they attacked when the killing occurred with a tremendous ferocity because their people were getting wiped out. And they drove down from the borders of Uganda towards Kigali, the capital, and to try to stop the genocide of their people. When that occurred, the Hutus actually ran out of bullets. And so they weren't any match for the RPF coming in, which was financed by some international monies. And the Hutus at that time blamed the Americans because they wouldn't resupply them with bullets. And so it was a very interesting dynamics there. But with that, because there was complications, because the Hutus, many of the civilians, had participated in the massacres. And so when the Tutsis drove on down into the main part of the country, there was a mass exodus. They estimate between 2.5 million to 3 million people across the border out of Rwanda. And they went into neighboring countries of Burundi, Tanzania, and then also the biggest group was down into what was then known as Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the border town where they came down the road, this is what you saw coming down this road. They estimated that over 25,000 people an hour were passing across the borders. And right behind them, the rebels were lobbing shells, which drove them down with a huge speed. And at the same time, they were mining the roads as they left. And so there's lots of complications that were there as a result of this. It's hard to imagine this many people fleeing and this kind of exodus occurring. In fact, if you looked up the roadsides, there, you would see where they hacked out brush as far up almost as what they could carry, the brush, where they made fires for cooking, they made lean-tos for shelters, but it looked like a locust had gone right down that road towards Goma, the capital. They were met at the border by the soldiers of Zaire, or the Congo. And the soldiers on the Congo at that particular time, we had a dictator that was running that country. He didn't pay his soldiers on the east side of Zaire, and so they got by extortion and force. And they disarmed as many as they could of the rebels coming down. It was a war of machetes in many respects. How many of you seen Hotel Rwanda? Yeah, that was pretty real from my perspective. When I saw that, it brought a lot back to me, what I saw over there. A lot. And they forced the people, the soldiers that met them at the border, forced them out onto lava beds. And it was at the base of a volcano that had blown up about 20 years earlier and put down a solid layer of lava down on there. Hadn't had time to break up, so it was just really solid. And part of the issue in that solid lava was that where do the people go? And so they started putting up tents there, and they were packed in there. Now, I went to 2 different refugee camps. The one refugee camp that I was at the most had 500,000 people in the size of Dallas, Oregon. So you can imagine how much people were squashed in there together. And that's real smoke, the campfires and the cooking. It was horribly, I would say, toxic in many respects. It was a very difficult place to be. And there was sort of a desperation there, because all they had was what they could carry, and they didn't carry a lot. And you can see how massive those refugee camps were. This is where I went in at the very beginning, was into the refugee camps like this. Prior to us going there, they had to get water. And they got water at any of the low spots they could. And what happened is that cholera broke out. And cholera is a waterborne disease that causes a diarrheal response that people will die of dehydration if it's not taken care of in 24 hours. It's that fast. And the cholera bug can stay alive in the soil up to 45 days. So it was what we call a hot zone as far as infection goes. And then Shigella, another diarrheal disease that's common in this part of the land, broke out as well. It was probably as devastating, maybe more devastating than the cholera broke out. Interestingly, they only had two antibiotics to stop the Shigella. And so they only allowed us to use one under real strict circumstances because they were afraid that the immunity would be developed on those medications, and then they would lose all they had for defense against Shigella, that type of Shigella. It was resistant. So everything ran downhill to the water supplies where they were gathering water, and the disease in the refugee camps was growing, and they had nothing to treat it with. They didn't have the medical personnel, and up to about 10,000 people a day were dying in the camps from this. They were running out of places to bury them. They just put them in mass graves, and they were still doing this when I got there. It's something we just don't see much of in the world, and we don't want to see it. But this was what was going on. In the Oregonian, a picture was put there by a guy by the name of Tim Zeelenbach. Tim was a freelance photographer, American, that was over there, and this is the picture that he put into the Oregonian. And this is the picture I saw. And I actually cut it out of the paper. I didn't normally do that, but this picture moved me to the point where I cut it out. That baby didn't have to die. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we could do something about it. And I knew as a paramedic I had the skill sets and the abilities to go over into an austere environment like that. And so I went over as a volunteer. I went over for 5 weeks total. In this article, with the picture, there's an article with a picture, and there were 11 organizations that were responding to this disaster. And so I called up to volunteer to go, and all 11 turned me down. And I go, oof, they didn't know how a paramedic could function in this kind of a world. They wanted doctors and nurses, but paramedics didn't have a place. Well, we're the front line here for a lot of bad stuff, and we can be there as well. And I thought, well, that's not acceptable. So I took that list and started down the list a second time. And I was again turned down by everyone. They said that I could make a donation, but they didn't want me as a person to go. And so on the third time down the list, because I wasn't stopping, by then I was a little bit angry, I went down the third down the list, and World Concern up in Seattle says, well, maybe we can take you. Do you have a passport? I says, I'll go to Seattle and get one next day. So I did that. And Northwest Medical Teams was also trying to send over a team. And they told me that I could be on the 5th or 6th team maybe in about a year out. And I thought, no, they're going to be dead by then. You need to have an immediate response. And so I said, well, thank you. But they were having trouble getting their team out. So everybody I called across the United States and around the world that were going there, I got information. And I passed that information on to Northwest Medical Teams so they could have logistics to get their team over there into Africa. They wanted on-the-ground logistics. And so on the way back from Seattle, I had some more information to give them about some phone numbers that were actually in Goma, Zaire, that they could call some people there on the ground to help get logistics moving ahead. I also gave them the name of the parents of the Rwandan ambassador who happened to live in Newburgh, that kind of information so that they could work on getting their teams over there. And I was meeting with the team guy, and he said, I said, thank you, appreciate that. And I said, well, maybe I'll see you over there. And I said, I think I may be able to go over with World Concern. And he looks at me, and have you ever had a pregnant pause when somebody looks at you? And you start feeling a little bit uncomfortable? That was what I had, as he looked at me. And he says, you're going to go no matter what, even if it's not with us. I go, yeah. And because this picture was driving me. And so anyway, I said yes, and another pregnant pause, and he picks up the phone and says, put Ron in the first team. This picture now is on my wall, a big picture, because in 1994, one thing we didn't have was Google. In 2004, 10 years later, I still had this picture of hanging up, the little picture hanging above my desk. And I saw Tim's name, so I Googled him, found him, and wrote him a thank you note for his picture. Because a lot of times you don't say thanks enough. And he flew up from Texas and brought me a proper picture. We've been friends ever since. One of the things that we set up immediately was a hospital out on the middle of this refugee camp. And I was involved with helping set it up initially. It was all in tents. We had to also clean the ground, and so we had to put in stuff that would help keep us from getting infected ourselves. Surfaces that we could wipe down over gravel so that we could do that. And we took care of a lot of sick people that were affected by a lot of diseases. It was more than just cholera, it was more than Shigella. We had pneumonias, we had all sorts of diseases that were killing lots of people and kids. And there were lots of kids over there. And one of the things that I did when I was there was because you saw the masses of people, we had a lot of kids that were separated from their parents and they got lost. And so here they were, and so we started an orphanage. I helped start an orphanage when I was there the first couple of weeks for these displaced kids. And the little kid there in the red coat, his name is Moses. And Moses made the news because he was found by a French soldier as they're getting ready to cover up the graves. He saw a movement, and the movement was Moses. And they didn't know what his name was, that's why they called him Moses. And they pulled him out, and he was at the site where I was working. They were taking care of him. They later found his grandparents and reunited him with his grandparents, but at that particular time, he didn't know his own name, he didn't a variety of things. And these kids were all alone. I could tell you lots of stories about that, but not today. When I was in Zaire, a guy came to our camp, and he had been up in Rwanda, and he said, I'm going to go up to Kigali the next day. It was the day after they cleared the mines. The very next day, he was going up to Kigali. And so I said, can I go with you? And he says, oh, I'd love to have somebody go with me. I really don't want to go by myself. He says, I'm a little afraid to go by myself. So I cleared with our team leader, and I joined with him, and we went up to Kigali, and that's a whole other story. But I was stopped 46 times at gunpoint by child soldiers and just mob soldiers along the way. They would throw a row of rocks to slow you down, or a log across the road to stop you, and they would check out what you're doing. And if you've ever been, nobody's been on the other end of an AK-47 with a 10 or 12-year-old holding it. It was a little uncomfortable, to say the least, but we treated them like normal people. We joked with them, we talked with them, we asked them about themselves, and we were let through, and we were able to get through up to Kigali and later on to the place I ended up at. Got to Kigali. This is typical of all the buildings. Everything was full of bullet holes. There were big holes in the ground from mines and grenades that had gone off. I'd never been to Warzone, and this was unbelievable what was there. And when I was there, they said, the guy whose place I stayed at, he came back from a meeting of the UN, and he says they're looking for volunteers of European descent, basically people with white skin, who would go in between the Hutus and the Tutsis because the French were pulling their troops out. And they were hoping that the presence of some white people would deter them from attacking and driving on down and driving out another 1.5 million people. Basically, they were asking for volunteer human shields. I never applied that term until later, but 4 of us volunteered and went in between the Hutus and Tutsis as human shields to try to deter further killing. And 3 of us were from Oregon, and another person was from the Philippines. And the 4 of us went down and set up right where the troops had been, in the foxholes that were around there. And if you look closely here, you can't probably see it very well, but there's all sorts of trenches and foxholes there. And they left some Senegal soldiers there, about 20 soldiers from Senegal that were part of the peacekeeping mission from the UN there to sort of protect us, but not from the rebels. They were protecting us from the locals more than anything, because the rebels would have just overrun them. They were light, and they couldn't actually take action unless fired upon, and if fired upon, it would be too late. So anyway, we set up medical tents up there. That was our medical clinic up there, was in those pup tents. And we took care of thousands of people while we were there, the short period of time we were there. In fact, on both teams, the ones that were still in Zaire and the people that were in Rwanda, there were 7 of us that were medical people, and we took care of 25,000 people in 5 weeks. So it gives you the volume of what we were doing there. That was our protection. And when the rebels did come in, we had tea with them, but they had RPG launchers, they had anti-tanks, they had huge weaponry. That would have not been a deterrent at all. And the people started coming to us there. They're pretty sick, very sick. And they brought us in these baskets. They would bring these baskets, and we had people carrying sick people 25 miles because we were the only medical people in that area at all. And we saw all sorts of things that I've never ever seen before or since, as far as disease goes, because we just don't have it here in this country. And this particular girl that was there in that particular basket, 4 men had carried her about 15 miles to get her care. And she had Shigella, and if she didn't get care, she would have died. So it shows you the little baskets that they had. That was their African ambulances, so to speak. And this particular girl here was one that was brought in. She actually went on and died. We couldn't stop her disease. It was too far. She was too far gone. And that was often the case, and that was tough on us, because we were really trying our hardest to stop, but we had limited supplies. We didn't even have a car there. They dropped us off, and so we were without a vehicle. The plan was that if they attacked, we would go out with the people and walk out of there. Very interesting experience to be there. And so we had limited medical supplies. We had limited aspects of what we could do with intravenous lines and things like that. We had some, but very limited in what we could do. That was my experience in Rwanda. And the most pivotal thing is I didn't talk about it for very much afterwards. It's been 25 years, and I'm just this year doing my first presentations on it. And it's not because, it wasn't post-traumatic stress or anything like that. To me, for me personally, it was sort of sacred ground. I don't know how to explain it other than that it was such a monumental experience for me that I didn't talk about it, just because it was sacred ground to me. And so telling you guys about it is one of the first expressions I have. And right now I'm working on a book for my kids so I can tell them the stories, because what I just told you is but this much of the experience. And when you get into this kind of environment and this kind of things, those kind of things, that's about all you can do at a setting is this much, when there's actually this much. After that, I went and took my daughter to work in the orphanages in Romania, and then I went to, after other disasters, after this, every vacation I had, I went to a world disaster. And it was actually a bit refreshing to go, believe it or not, because it changed my perspectives to the point where when I went back, I felt it wasn't the norm. It was an avenue of refreshing. And I went to the tsunami in Sri Lanka and Indonesia. I went to Hurricane Mitch in Honduras a couple times, Hurricane Pauline in Mexico, the earthquakes in India and Turkey, and different places like that. All of them were pretty devastating. But this was different. This was different because this was people on people. And this was all a human-caused disaster. And that was also especially trying as I sat and recognized that. One of the things that I remember sitting in the tent working on some people, and my impression was, these are the Nazis. I was taking care of the people who had committed the homicides and the genocide. That was who I was over there helping. And so I stopped for a minute, and I said, no, I'm going to take care of people. And I can't go there. And so it was a trying thought for me as I went to that kind of a process. So I end with that people can step up and make a difference. And that's why Rotary has been, I like Rotary because it was service above self. We always need to find ways to step up in life and do what we can with the skills that we have and the abilities we have. And that's sort of been my motto ever since Rwanda. So, thank you.
Up there, sorry.
Okay.
You were looking for the mic, so I thought I'd sit back.
Hi, I'm Jeanette. Thank you so much for this presentation. In 1994, we moved to Washington, D.C. and rented the home from the newly appointed ambassador to Rwanda. And they were telling us before they left that they were a good fit. They knew the languages, and it was rather peaceful there at the time. They thought more peaceful than some. And then within 3 months, this is what happened what you described. I went over about a year later and spent some time there, and of course, it looked different. But even in the places that we visited, like refugee camps or orphanages and so forth, it was pretty amazing and depressing. We were told that if you go to the general market there, people who had something before would find their former things that they had in their house were being sold at the market because there had been so much looting, so they could go buy their own stuff back. But the most interesting thing for me was I went with a young man who went to visit the radio stations, and he had a talk with one of the men and they talked about the place of the hate propaganda of the radio stations that was going on before this event happened. And at the time, I had no idea what he was talking about until, he explained that to me. And it's just interesting then to know that we have hate radio here. And that's scary because that was the precursor of that event. But thank you so much.
My biggest concern coming back, I don't express it much, but my biggest concern coming back was that it could happen here. And that bothered me a lot when I first came back, because those were people like we are people. And getting driven to that kind of hatred and to that kind of distrust and negative stuff. It worried me about our own country, because that was back in '94 that I had this worry.
Janet, over here. Can you just spend a little time walking through what do you do once you're brought a person? Where do you start? You or whoever else is around. I'm assuming you have translators and try to find out what's wrong. But where do you start, and kind of the steps you go through with what you're given? And then also, did any of your colleagues contract any of the diseases that you were
Sure.
encountering?
We start much like we start here if we have a multiple casualty incident where we have more than one patient, and we start with what we call triage. And our triage was not like a 5-person rec or a 6-person rec. We would get ready to go to the clinic where we're going to be taking care of people and have 250 people in line. And so part of my job was to go through the line and do triage, and I moved the ones that were most severe up to the beginning of the line to take care of them. One of the most valuable things that was told to me was by a guy that I knew that had been all over the world himself. And he told me, he said, "You're going to see lots and lots of people." He says, "Take care of the one in front of you." And that was a valuable piece of advice, is we had to take care of the one in front of us. And so, but we did the triage in mass triage, and that was my job actually. I would go triage the entire crowd and then push the people up forward. Nobody got the diseases at all. We didn't get any diseases ourselves, but we were very, very careful. I mean, we took good hygiene. We did all the things we needed to do. The other part was concerning to us, because we're doing IVs and lots of things like that, is there was a high incidence of HIV there as well. And so that really concerned us as well. And we didn't have needle depositories, so we would collect the needles and things like that and burn them and then bury them, just as a methodology for trying to control the infection and doing the best infection control we have. And one of the things that I did when I was there also was they were concerned they didn't have a hand washing system for hand washing up in the middle of this refugee camp where they're taking care of patient after patient after patient. So I took a Leatherman tool and crafted with a Leatherman tool out of a 5-gallon biscuit tin that was there, and created a hand washing system that we put betadine in, and we're able to have a hand washing system that we were able to do. But I had to create that because we didn't have it there.
Pat here. My husband had offices, and Northwest Medical Team was at its infancy, beginning out, to start out. And there was people in there calling nurses and doctors, having them to sign up to go to some of these places. And I remember thinking, I was so impressed. I said, these doctors and nurses are going to take time off from their jobs and pay their own way and to go to some of these places. I just thought it was marvelous. But I'm wondering, how did you get your funding to go over there in Rwanda? Friends,
family, church. I actually was able to raise more money than it took me to get over there, and we used that for supplies as well. They were able to pay for supplies as well.
Thank you.
Hi, over here in the back. Can you explain who is sitting on your dais with you, and what does it?
This means nothing to me, but Lee Coyne here brought it in just for a prop for the event. Thanks, Lee.
Yeah, I have a question about how you navigate the politics while you're there. Who provides security for you? How do you avoid looking like you're not siding with one faction instead of the other? Things like that. How do you? We
partnered with an in-country group, which helped. And that was, the group we partnered with was called Adventist Development Relief Agency, which is very big in that particular part of Africa. And so they helped us maneuver that. We didn't get into politics per se, but that was how we were able to maneuver us, to have in-country partners that helped us. They provided us the security. So that was how. I don't know if that answers your question, or do you want to elaborate more?
Yeah, I was just wondering, do others view you, how do the people you are serving view you, as totally apolitical, as...
Well, we had something they really wanted. They wanted the medications. They were very, very sick, and so we didn't go into really. We didn't feel like we were a target at all. We felt like we were there to help them, and they knew that as well. When we first got into we did a roadside clinic that we established, and when we got there, there was human feces probably every 3 square feet. There was so many people had gone through there, and remember, cholera stays alive for 45 days in the soil. So this is a real hot zone. So we didn't actually have shovels at that point in time, so we actually gloved up and removed it all by hand. And it sounds sort of ugly, but that we didn't have choices. And one of the young girls that was there started carrying it away herself. She saw what we were doing. She was 16. She started carrying it away in her hands. Her name was Jacqueline. And Jacqueline started doing it, and we stopped her, washed her up, and gave her gloves, and then she helped us clear that. The reason she was helping us is because she wanted us to take care of her mother who was sick. And while we were cleaning that up, she went back home, and her mother had died. And so Jacqueline stayed with our clinic and helped us packaging medicines, all sorts of different types of things, taking care of bandages and stuff like that. And so that was the environment in which we went into. Didn't feel really threatened by anybody per se, except I felt a little threatened by some of the soldiers that were there in Zaire that were stopping us, asking us for money, and we said no, and I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that.
Hi, this is Cassia. Now, in your pictures, you have these long streams of people, millions of people and thousands of people walking down the roads. Now, did the Hutus go to one country and the Tutsis go to another country? Because they were driving each other, it sounds like.
No, it was the Hutus mainly that were fleeing. They fled into mainly three different countries. There was more than that, but mainly 3 different countries. The bulk of them crossed over into Zaire. And those people you see there were just Hutus. And the Tutsis were the armed people behind them.
Did they ever come back?
What?
Did they ever come back?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, we started seeing people going back even before we left. So yes, and they were asking people to come back, and they did. Not all.
Is the hatred still as bad as ever there between the Hutus and the Tutsis, or what's the situation today?
Well, they've been working really hard on reconciliation. There's been a lot of reconciliation efforts being led by a lot of people, but there's still some underlying tensions, and depending on where you are within the context of that, if you get into Kigali, the capital, Rwanda, there's less tensions than if you go down across the border into Zaire. There's still some people that were leaders in the genocide still in the border towns of Zaire, still raping and killing.
Paul up here. The news, even though I'm not sure about the details, but it seems like there's the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's an area where there's all kinds of very civil strife and so forth. Is that a tribal thing like this Hutu-Tutsi thing, or is that more power grabs by various factions?
It's both. It's both tribal and it's also power grabs, depending on the groups. From my perspective, from what I know of it, I haven't been there for a while, but from what I read, that's what it still is. And they also have lots of other things. That's where the Ebola is kicking up in that region that we were at and stuff like that. So they're not through their tragedies yet.
This is Don. When I hear the name Rwanda, my blood pressure goes up. I saw the movie Hotel Rwanda, and I've been told that's a pretty realistic depiction of it. one thing that was apparent to me anyway in the movie was the UN troops. They were in a very difficult situation. I mean, there are a lot of people who could have killed them in an instant. And I think the UN made the decision to pull them out, and that's one thing that precipitated the bloodshed. Also, the United States, the militarily most powerful nation in the world, did nothing. Sometime after the massacre, I believe Bill Clinton flew into the Rwanda airport and publicly apologized and then flew out. Do you get angry when you think of the inaction of our own government, who could have, it seems to me, prevented the genocide?
He didn't apologize for me. I went. Even when the killing was, there was still killing going on, I went. So he didn't apologize for me. But no, I just, it's, those kind of situations are so complex, so difficult, that hindsight is often, you know, as they say, 20/20. And so I try not to get into hindsight too much in those kinds of things, because those things are fraught with all sorts of tough stuff. And as far as the United Nations, when the killings were on, there were still United Nations people there. In fact, 8 Belgian soldiers were massacred by the mobs there. They had a special hatred for the Belgians because of the colonizations types of stuff. So there was genuine concern, and the mandates of the UN is a peacekeeping force, not a force of military, and so they're very limited in what they can do as far as that. We had the Senegal soldiers, for example. They had orders that they were not to shoot unless in a defensive position, and if they did that, and we had been attacked, it would have been too late. So they're in a position that's really tough, because you don't want them doing armed conflict. You really want them to be a peacekeeping force, but it's very, very difficult in those kind of circumstances.
Hi, Ron. This is Lee here.
Hi, Lee.
I'm wondering, in terms of the United Nations, this happens to be UN month, what did the UN do in humanitarian aid, and what we have learned since then, that if another sequel happens, what could we do the next time around?
Well, one of the things that happened on an international level was the filtration of water systems, because that was critical to stopping the advance of cholera, was to have a source of clean water. And we were involved with that as well. As we were taking care of the disease, it would do us no good if we did not have clean water established. And so that was one of the things that happened on an international level. The UN was involved with that, logistics of that. We had filtration systems coming from all over the world to try to, because that's a lot of water to clean up for that many people. So to stop the spread of cholera, you had to do both the medical plus the water. And so that was done.
Paul here again. Since you've been going on other emergency medical teams and so forth, since then has come up from a world or organizational standpoint, were there lessons learned there, and have organizations got better at handling these kind of things, or is it still sort of piecemeal?
I think there are some things that have gotten better, some things that haven't. We still have conflict all over the world. When I was in Sri Lanka during the tsunami, we had the Tamil Tigers on over the northeastern section of the island, and we had the Sinhalese, which were the larger population in the southern and western portion of the island. And there was armed conflict that was going on while we were there. Yet the tsunami was no respecter of politics. And so it hit all those areas. And so we went both. We went across the line and served both, and just did not take a side or a position on any of that. And that was fine. We did have one of our persons that got pistol whipped by one of the forces there, but I evacuated them. I was over there. I evacuated the team out. And then when it got settled down, we put them back in. But some things like that happen. As far as Sri Lanka, one of the interesting things was we had some volunteer computer people who GIS mapping was just coming into play. And they geomapped the entire island as to where you needed the water supplies, whether you needed the different things, because we were bringing supplies in one side of the island, and we had to distribute it around the coastal area, and there was no coastal highway. It had been wiped out, so we had to do everything long transports, long ways. And if we got it at the wrong spot, then we had to come back, and it was just logistics. And so they did a great job in logistics that I had not seen before. And so when I came back from Sri Lanka, my next job was Marion Polk Food Share. And so we GIS mapped poverty in our 2-county area and made sure that we had pantries in the areas of greatest need. And that was how I was able to bring that lesson home to here.
This is Charlene. My sister and husband were in the Peace Corps for 3 years in Malaysia. And one of the things before they came home is they got a lot of indoctrination about coming back to the United States and culture shock. And I wondered how, and that was nothing compared to what you've experienced, how do you come back to the United States and see how we live and act and cope with what you're doing?
Well, I had the advantage of being a paramedic for many years, 14 years prior to going. And I have seen the worst here of disasters in a lesser of a scale. But the impact on humanity and families of somebody losing somebody with a gunshot or a car wreck or whatever is the same as if they lost it overseas in some of these disasters. It's the same effect on families. And so learning to cope with those kinds of things was something that I learned as a paramedic to do, that I was able to use some of the same skills. Part of it's the support structure that you have. Part of it is having good coping mechanisms. And so those are some of the ways that I was able to deal with it. I did not find it tremendously traumatic. I had more trauma from a personal standpoint here in the States on some of the calls I went on than I had over there.
Oh, well, I looks like we're out of questions right now. Give the mic. We want to really thank Phil. Well, Phil can thank you, or he's the one that heard you at Rotary. I know this can't be an easy thing for you to do.
Yeah, it's not really easy to talk about tragedies like this that affect so many people, so many families, and are still affecting our world. It isn't easy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ron.